Welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to change axle seals and wheel bearings on a C-clip style or semi-floating style of rear axle. So I'm standing here with this 2012 Dodge Ram. Actually, I think it was just Ram by this point. It's kind of a changeover year. But Ram 1500 pickup with a ZF 9 1/4, also known as a 235 millimeter axle. And we're going to go through changing the seal and bearing in it. I'm actually going to put two seals in it, but just the one side bearing. This will be pretty much the same process on any vehicle you're going to do a C-clip style wheel seal and bearing in, but this is a 2012 Ram. Okay, before we get started here, this Ram axle, this ZF 9 1/4, has a drain plug here and a fill plug up in here on the front side. You're not going to be able to see either one of those, but I'll talk about them. So there they are. Now both the drain and the fill plug on this axle are a 14 millimeter Allen head style. And as with anything that I'm going to do this on, before I drain any fluid out, I'm going to make sure that I can refill it. So I'm going to take that 14 millimeter Allen, and I'm not going to remove it, I'm just going to loosen it up. I loosened the fill plug, it moved nice and easy, and then I'm going to take the drain plug and remove that. If your axle does not have a drain plug, then you will drain it by removing this cover, which we're going to have to do anyway, but because this has a drain plug, I'll go ahead and pull that out and let it drain through that, so it's a little bit less messy when we pull the cover off. We're still going to drain extra fluid out. So there it goes. There's the old fluid draining out of the axle into my drain pan. While that's going, I'll go ahead and just start pulling these cover bolts. So on this truck, we've got 3 bolts that are kind of difficult to get at with the electric impact. This top one here, and these two. Now these two, this sway bar on the rear actually moves really easy. So you can just pull that off of there and get enough clearance to get into those two. Okay, so now what I've done is I've left this upper bolt. I'm going to slide my drain pan off to the side. I'm going to take a small chisel, a little hammer, drive that up in there. Now this is held on with silicone, so it's going to be stuck. I left this upper bolt in there just to kind of hold the cover up in place when it does finally separate. So there we go. And with that drain plug removed, nothing came out. Now if you don't have the drain plug, this is where your fluid's going to start to drain. So go ahead. Oh, drain pan's running away. This cover comes up through the side like that. Alright, now this next step, you're going to need the truck in neutral in either the transmission or transfer case. You're going to have to move the rear axle. So once this thing is in neutral, you're just going to spin the drive shaft until we get to a spot where this little bolt is visible on this Chrysler axle or ZF axle, whatever you want to call it. There's actually a spot right there that gives you access to it in the cap. That's a 5/16 or 8 millimeter. They're kind of the same deal. And go ahead, take that out. Now this bolt holds in the cross pin, and there's some Loctite on there. So I'll clean that up and put a little Loctite on it when I put it back together. Now theoretically at this point, I should be able to reach back in. There's a cross pin here. And I might be able to pull it with the magnet, but probably not. Nope. Okay, so I'll reach back in behind it, press up on that. I may have to roll the drive shaft in order to get to a spot where I can really press that, because I can't really reach with the pinion gear where it's at. So now I can get back onto the bottom side of it, push that up, grab it, pull it out, and with this particular axle, actually it just clears. I thought it was going to hit that panhard bar before it came out. But I'll take the cross pin, set it off to the side for now. Okay, so I've got you right on top of it. I'm going to rotate this around a little bit more. Now as you're doing this one has a limited slip, so they stay in pretty good. But if you've got an open differential, these gears may slide around and move. Just make sure you watch that if they start to fall out. So a lot of the times there will be a washer or a bushing or whatever you want to call it underneath there. So make sure you watch that. Now you've got a pretty good view. What I'm going to do is I've already got the brakes off. I took the brakes off before I started this video. This is the end of the driver's side axle shaft. This is the end of the passenger side. I'm going to take the passenger side axle shaft, and from the end I'm going to push in on it. And when I do that, it may drop the C-clip out. Okay, nope, actually, yep, there it is. So the C-clip right there, that's what retains the axle. I'll just take my magnet, great, drop it into the thing. That magnet wasn't quite strong enough for what I was trying to do, but I pull this C-clip, and that's why it's called a C-clip style axle. So I pulled that C-clip out. I will take it, set it off to the side, and now at this point, I'm actually going to kind of pull the camera back. We'll remove the axle. Alright, now with that C-clip out, I'm going to just grab the end of the axle, take a clean rag, pull this out, and actually what I've been kind of shown as a trick is when you get out here to the end, you can actually just use the axle shaft to pry the seal out. That didn't work real well on this one, so I'm just going to go to my normal method, which is use a big pry bar, get in there behind it, smack it, seals out. Now before you do that, you should really make sure that you have the right seal. And I didn't, so now I'm in a situation where I really hope I have the correct seal. There we go, it fits the axle. And it fits the axle shaft. So thankfully I do have the correct seal, so I'm going to be able to drive this home today. I'm also going to change the axle bearing, which is going to use these adapters with a slide hammer. That one will work, but let's see if the size up will fit too. Yeah, that one's the winner. So I'll leave that one in there, grab my slide hammer, thread my, actually, yeah, I'll just leave it. Okay, thread my slide hammer into the axle adapter. You want to thread that a good ways in there, so you're putting stress on the threads. It's actually not a bad idea to kind of snug up that jam nut as well. And then the slide hammer is going to come out, hit against this end, and it's basically hammering away from the axle. Okay, and there is the old bearing. Now there's really nothing wrong with this bearing, but because this side was leaking and this truck does have 200,000 miles on it, decided that I would, for the cost of a new Mopar bearing, just go ahead and replace it. Now if I only had the choice between a parts store and leaving this OEM in there, I would probably leave this OEM because this was a pretty good quality bearing. Now to reinstall, what you're going to do is find something that you can drive the bearing with. So this is an old bearing race off of something else. If you're in a shop that's been around for a while, you'll probably have all kinds of things like this that you use to press and hammer and stuff like that. Now, I actually had to take this one and grind around the edge just a little bit because you want it to be just slightly smaller than what you're hammering in. You want it to hit on this outer edge. You don't want it to hit here in the center, but you also don't want it to get stuck in the axle. So I'll go ahead, I'll line this thing up. Actually, there's oil in there again. So I'll dry out this end of the tube again real quick. Take my bearing, line it up, use my new bearing driver. You just want to make sure you're going in nice and even. And it will kind of self-align as it goes back in, but you do want to try to keep this as level as possible. Okay. So in this particular case, you want to run this in to where it's pretty well flush. There's a two-step machining process in here. The bearing area is slightly smaller than the seal, so we ran this in until it is flush around the entire thing, which is where the other one was at. So now we've got that installed. Now, the reason I put a bearing in this is I'm fairly certain I put a wheel seal in this side not too awful long ago. Granted, it's been probably at least 50,000 miles, but because this is the side that keeps leaking, I measured the axle shafts while they were out and I inspected where the seal rides. So I know the axle shaft is good. You don't want to see any grooving or weirdness there. So I'm going to go ahead and put an axle bearing in it in hopes that there was maybe a little bit of play there that would cause the axle seal to keep leaking. Now, to install the axle seal, I usually keep a bunch of blocks of wood, and I know this actually looks pretty nasty, but I cleaned it all off with brake clean. It's actually pretty clean. It's just stained from oil. So I've got this block of wood that is perfectly sized. Now you're going to want to take a look at your bearing. These Mopar bearings came with a nice heavy sealant around the edge here, so I'm not really going to have to add anything else. Sometimes I will take a little bit of Gear Oil Safe RTV and put that on the seal as well, but I don't think I'm going to need that with this. These ones shouldn't leak. And actually, before I put it in, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but it came with grease installed in the lip of the seal as well, which if your seal comes without grease, you need to put a little bit of grease inside of here. The reason being that is all that lubricates this rubber and keeps it from tearing up. So I'll go ahead and this should just slide in. Okay. Take my clean block of wood. You want to try to put it in even, and seals very rarely like to go in even on their own, but this one is actually dragging pretty straightforward. Okay, so we'll just drive that down to where this meets all the way around. Okay, now I kind of talked about checking this axle out to see for wear, and if I look at it right here, there's kind of a discolored area. That's where the bearing rides, and then we've got two shiny areas. That's where the seal rides, but there is no actual groove in the axle. And I also measured this diameter and compared it with the other side, and they are identical. So there should not be any play in the bearing area. So that's now ready to reinstall. You always want to clean this up and look it over before you do that. Now before I reinstall this axle, I'm going to take just a little bit of conventional gear oil. This axle runs a synthetic oil, but I'm just going to use this conventional, and I'm going to fill up that bearing area. So we've got a brand new bearing, it's raw metal, there's no oil on it, all the oil drained out of the tube. So in order to protect that when we first start moving, I'm going to put just a little bit of oil. Now I'm using conventional because I personally think it kind of sticks in an area a little bit. I think the synthetic flows very well, but I think it also flows away from where you need it. So this being all brand new, it's going to match together. I'm going to run a little bit of conventional. So I'm just going to take that, fill up that area, make sure your hands are nice and clean. And you can actually, I don't know if that microphone picked it up, I'm just kind of rolling the bearing over to coat the oil all the way around there. And as I was rolling it, it changed tones. I'm going to put just a little bit more in there. Do kind of the same thing. I just want to make sure that there's oil on all of that surface before this axle shaft starts rolling. Now you could also theoretically take some grease and pack that bearing with grease. Just not a lot, just like a little bit. And that grease would have the same effect. It would protect everything as it wears in. I'm just going to use some oil. So after that oil is in there, I'm going to pick up my axle shaft. Make sure it is nice and clean as well. Gently feed it down the center. As we get to the end, on this axle you have to get this to feed through an adjuster and then into the actual spider gears in the differential. So that one went in real easy, no problem. You might have to fight that a little bit. I've also done this a few times, so it probably goes in a little bit easier for me than it might for somebody that has not. Okay, so I've got you set back up where the axle shaft is now through these spider gears again. I've got my C-clip cleaned up, ready to go back in. I'm just going to reach out, push in on this axle shaft. Ooh, this one's got to push in a little bit. Okay, so push in on the axle shaft. Now I hold that C-clip in place with my one hand and I pull out on the axle with the other, which then sets that back out. Now I'm ready to grab my cross pin, which we've kept in a nice clean dry place. Rotate this axle back with the drive shaft a little bit to where we can set it inside of here. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but the spider gears have shifted a little bit. I'm going to grab an axle shaft, spin it until those line up. Once those line up, the cross pin should drop right back in. Now, as I drop this back in, I need to pay attention to where this hole is at on the cross pin. It's got to line up with the bolt hole, which I'm also going to rotate this back farther to line that bolt hole back up with the groove in the cap. Okay, so now that I've got that rotated back to where it's lined up, I just simply drop this down into its home. It sits nice and flush. Okay, so this bolt had a little bit of Loctite on it before it came out. So I just put a little bit of blue on there. Now what I've got to do is kind of figure out how to line up this pin. There it is. So sometimes you got to wiggle that around a little bit to get everything lined up. I put my little bit of blue Loctite on there. Now there is probably a torque spec for this, but I can say I've never used one, and I don't think I've ever had one of these pins back out. Had to break off, they snap like right here, and then the cross pin comes out and the axle destroys. But that wasn't even one that I worked on, so I'm just going to put it in there. I've got a pretty long 1/4 inch drive ratchet, so I'm going to hold that. And if you want to look up a torque spec for your application, go ahead, but I'm just going to crank that down with a little bit of blue Loctite, and that'll be fine. The reason you don't want to use red Loctite is red Loctite you have to heat to get out of there. I know there was white that came off of that when I opened it up, but that's factory Loctite and you really can't go by color on that stuff. So now the axle is back together. What I'm going to do now is clean these mating area where the cover goes back on, and we'll go from there. Okay, so this is not the manufacturer recommended procedure, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Scotch-Brite pad on an angle die grinder. I'm going to watch the rotation. The wheel spins that way, so I'm going to use this forward edge and kind of blow things away from the differential itself. And I've got this paper towel covering it up, but here we go. Oops. So go all the way around the whole thing like that. And I'm going to move the camera because I don't want it to get splashed by gear oil. Let's take our silicone. This is gear oil safe silicone. And you want just a thin layer. You don't want to get it inside the bolt holes, but just a thin layer all the way around the axle. So I'm going to take my finger, spread that out. If you get too much of this on here, it'll spread and kind of shove down into the case. It can break off, it can clog things up. Not a great situation. I guess I did kind of skip a step there. While you're, once you've got these cleaned off, you want to use some brake clean or something to clean everything up really good so that your silicone has a good surface to seat to. Okay. Grab a bolt. Throw one on the ground for good measure. Line up your bolt holes. Shove this cover into place. Okay, I always start a top and a bottom. Okay. Now go ahead, get all of these started. Again, you want to try to not get silicone down in these holes. If you get too much, if you get silicone building up down in these bolt holes, it can actually crack the case. It basically acts as a hydraulic wedge when you're tightening these down. And in a lot of cases, they're pretty thin near where these bolt holes are at. So if you fill one of these holes totally up with silicone, and then as you're tightening it up, it'll actually crack the case. Is that a common thing? No. Have I ever seen it? Yes. Now, as I'm putting this back together, I'm just going to tighten these down by hand. Again, I'm sure there's a torque spec, but snug. Okay. And you're going to do this kind of like a wheel. You're going to do a crisscross pattern. Work your way around the differential cover. So now the cover is sealed, it's tight, it's ready to go. I'm going to grab my drain plug and reinstall that. So tighten it up by hand first. And then this is pipe thread. If you over tighten these, you can actually crack a differential too. Again, not common. Usually there's enough meat around where this thing's at that you're not really gonna crack it. But it doesn't need to be super tight. It's gotta be tight. It seals based on whether or not it's tight. But like right there, that's snug. I don't have a torque spec for it, but it's tight without crushing it. Now, if I under tightened it, it will leak at this spot, and I can come back and just kind of give it a little bit of extra. If For the fill plug, I'll go ahead and pull that right now. But that's mostly at this point just in case there's any brake clean or anything. It's got a spot to vent off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut the camera off. I'm not doing the brakes on camera. So while this silicone sets up, because you're supposed to let the silicone set up before you put any fluid in. So I'm going to pull this drain plug, set it off to the side. I'm going to do the rear brakes. So that's going to take me at least a half hour, probably closer to an hour by the time I clean brackets and all that stuff. And I'll put them back together. And then after that, I'll turn the camera back on and we'll fill this with fluid. Now this silicone is set for a while. It should be good. All I have left to do is add my gear oil, which is in the shadow down here. So it's a super fun spot. If it were up here, you could just use the bottle. But because of where it's at, I've got a little chunk of 3/8 rubber hose that's on the end here. And because this is a synthetic oil, it kind of flows pretty good through there. So this takes, or should take, just short of 3 quarts of oil. This gear oil that I'm putting in right now has a limited slip additive in it. Make sure you read that. If you've got a limited slip like this one does with clutch packs in it, you need to make sure you're putting a limited slip additive in with your oil. Otherwise, you'll destroy the limited slip. So make sure you've got limited slip. I'm going to go ahead and put 2 quarts of the synthetic in there. And then I'm going to top it off with conventional. And that's because that's what I like to do. I actually like to do like a 50-50 mix of conventional and synthetic. But because it's easier to just do it this way, I will put 2 quarts. Actually, you know what? I'm going to stop right there. So I've already got a quart in there. I'm going to finish filling this up with conventional. So I'm just going to finish filling it up with conventional. And honestly, like 15 years ago when synthetics were not brand new, but kind of a hot trend in the automotive world, I was really on board with synthetic oils. As time has gone on, I think conventional has some advantages, especially in stuff that sits. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people that disagree with that, but I do think that conventional does have some advantages. Also, theoretically, if you do a 75% conventional with 25% synthetic, you get like 90-some% of the benefit of the synthetic oil anyway. So, again, it's just me being weird. And I think that might be full. Oh yeah. So that's full. It's dripping all over the ground. Great. And just like the lower one, you're just gonna snug this up to get it to where it is snug. Like with this big 1/2 wrench, I just have my thumb on it. You probably can't see that, but it is not going real tight. So that differential is nice and full of fluid. And I just need to clean up where I started to drip here. So that's how you put seals and bearings in a semi-float, C-clip, whatever you want to call it, rear axle. Thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you later.